Hey guys, it's Paul Myers, licensed counselor, owner and lead therapist of Intentional Counseling. We're a group practice in Frisco, Texas, and we specialize in mental health. And today I'm going to cover the difference between a Vacillator childhood imprint, which we covered in a previous video, and borderline personality disorder. We had a subscriber ask the question, what's the difference between these two? And so I'm going to cover that today, and we'll go over an overview of the similarities and the differences of the two, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense so you don't get them mixed up. So when we're looking at borderline personality disorder, I listed some of the key characteristics of it here, and then with the Vacillator Imprint, I listed some key characteristics of that as well. We can kind of do a comparative analysis between the two, and hopefully you'll see the distinction. There are some similarities, so I could understand if you get them mixed up, but there's some distinct differences. So the key component to borderline personality disorder is a deep, intense fear of abandonment. And so everything they do is a very frantic attempt to avoid this sense of abandonment that they have. Okay. Now, a lot of their fears are not rational, so they're not really, they're usually based off past hurts that they have, past wounds, and so there's that sense of abandonment that they have, and they'll do anything to avoid that, even if it's a perceived abandonment that isn't actually, they're not being abandoned, they just perceive everything through that lens. So there's that warped perception a lot of the time as far as I'm going to get abandoned. So that's the big thing. Expectations of abandonment. They tend to have abuse and trauma in their background, or some form of neglect or abandonment in their background as well. And they have this fear of that occurring again. Okay? So very much a fear-based thing. It is a personality disorder. One thing to note, personality disorders are a really steep, intense diagnosis. It's not something you take lightly. It's not something you don't self-diagnose. You're not a diagnostician. People go to school for 8 years to be a diagnostician, and so it's not something you can just Google online and look at diagnostic criteria and then self-diagnose. I would not do that. Just to claim that someone has a personality disorder is a very steep claim. So be hesitant and apprehensive to self-diagnose or diagnose others, because people go to school for that for 8 years minimum. So this is just something that you want an overview of it. The intense fear of abandonment characterizes everything that they do. The Vacillator is different. The Vacillator has really, really high expectations of a relationship, really high hopes that that person is going to meet all their needs and make them happy and fulfill them and really intimately meet that need for love. Okay? So the Vacillator's expectations are really high and they're really unrealistic, and they're thinking they can get unwavering love with no flaws and no setbacks and no negatives, only the positive, versus the borderline personality disorder always expects to be abandoned by default, no matter what. Okay? So that's a distinct difference in expectation. Borderline personality disorder, it has lots of fear and paranoia. It's very easily triggered, so it perceives things as getting abandoned or you're going to get abandoned. So it's very much reactionary. The paranoia, it's very transient. It doesn't last very long. It's very fleeting. It comes and goes. There's a lot of instability with this disorder in general. I would not wish it on my worst enemy. In my personal opinion, it's one of the top 5 most intense disorders to have. And so it's not something you take very lightly. But the Vacillator, this is much more lighthearted than this. So that's a distinct difference, is the level of severity is much more intense with this personality disorder than it is with this childhood imprint. Okay? But paranoia and fear, those are Huge, okay? Really easily triggered. Versus the vacillator, they tend to dictate the emotional environment. So borderline personality disorder is very reactionary to their circumstances. In fact, I would say the circumstances completely dictate them. Versus the vacillator, they're pretty consistently dictating the environment emotionally in a relationship. So there's a little bit more consistency with the vacillator. Versus this is dependent on the circumstance completely. Their moods change very frequently. The third thing is the extreme idealization, and then going back and forth between idealizing the person you're in a relationship with versus devaluing them, right? That right there is actually the most similar thing about these two about these two issues. So that's exactly the same as the vacillator. So that's where people can get that mixed up. The vacillator does the same thing. They idealize the relationship, and then when it doesn't meet their expectations, they get very angry, they get hurt, they get very deeply wounded, and they withdraw and punish their spouse with anger and bitterness. Borderline personality disorder, exactly the same. But I will say, BPD is much more severe, so the devaluing is much more hurtful and damaging and can be abusive. Versus, the vacillator, it's much more, not nearly as intense as that. So they're really just hurt. The vacillator, they're just hurt. And rather than being vulnerable, they're showing their anger. Okay? Versus the BPD can be abusive at times. So they idolize and then they really devalue. It's very potent. Okay, very similar on that one. The next one, BPD, there's frequent suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation. A lot of the time there's self-mutilation tendencies, whether they cut or burn themselves as well. So it's much more intense. It's very, very dangerous for that person. Most people with BPD seek therapy or treatment because of that reason right there, which is very obvious to see how dangerous that could be. And that's a pretty consistent theme with BPD. Versus the vacillator, they're just disappointed, and that because their expectations aren't realistic, they're disappointed, they're hurt, and that leads to the anger, right? The disappointment leads to anger. Okay. Borderline personality disorder does have frequent anger outbursts. They're very extreme, they're very reactionary, and they're really unwarranted, and they don't fit. A lot of times they don't make any sense. It's just kind of a trigger for them. Those anger outbursts tend to be very intense and pretty hurtful. Versus the vacillator, they do have anger outbursts, but it's more of a secondary emotion to cope with their hurt. So they kind of mask their hurt with anger to cope. Tension builds over time with the vacillator. So they start off really positive and really have high hopes for the relationship, and over time, as the relationship sets in, they start getting more disappointed, more hurt by that. So, okay. Next, abuse and neglect and trauma a lot of time are in almost like a prerequisite for BPD. It's almost guaranteed that that's going to be in their background. It comes from that most of the time. Versus the Vacillator Imprint comes from just inconsistent parenting, where the parent is parenting the vacillator based off their mood. And it's just inconsistent and unpredictable, right? So it's not nearly as bad of a childhood background or history. Not both unhealthy, but not as severe. Down here, BPD's self-image, they're very insecure. Their self-image is constantly shifting and changing. And that depends on, again, circumstances and what's going on in their lives, what's around them. And they're adjusting to their circumstances. So their self-image is shifting. Very loose, fragile sense of self. And it's changing a lot. And a lot of the time they have dissociative tendencies. So dissociation would be a sense of detachment emotionally, There's different types of disassociation. There's depersonalization, which is when you separate from yourself. It's kind of like having out-of-body experience, you know, like you separate self from self. Derealization is another form of disassociation where you're still you, but you know what you see around you is different. So like, let's say I'm in a classroom setting, I'm still me, but then when I disassociate, now I'm in a jungle. So the environment around me is different, even though I'm still me. I'm the same. So depersonalization, derealization are very potent dissociative tendencies. The more mild disassociations would be just that sense of emotional detachment from things at times to cope, which is a trauma response a lot of the time as well. So, Vacillator, they just tend to be more fixated and focused on their spouse and their partner in their relationship and what their partner's doing and not doing, and they're very hurt by their partner, and they tend to kind of contradict themselves and put the responsibility on their partner rather than focusing on themselves and working on them. And so, because they feel kind of justified in their expectations, and a lot of time vacillators aren't very self-aware, and they have a tendency to focus on their spouse rather than themselves, and so that's common with the vacillator here. The last thing is there's high impulsivity with borderline personality disorder, which can be very destructive, and they can self-sabotage. And so examples of self-sabotage and unhealthy ways of impulsivity would be excessive spending, abusing substances, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or gambling, or addictive things, binge eating, sexual promiscuity, reckless driving, things like that. Just kind of impulsive behavior that's very destructive, as you can imagine, right? Very dangerous risk-taking. Versus the vacillator is going to withdraw from their partner and then wait for their partner to come to them so that they feel loved, and so it kind of puts that responsibility on their partner to accommodate them and meet their needs, right? So that's a lot, not nearly as volatile. But you can see being problematic. So that's pretty much the overview right there. So if you relate to either of these, don't beat yourself up. You can actually get treated and make a lot of progress. With borderline personality disorder, a lot of the time they see that in people that got treated that are in their 30s and 40s, they had about a 50% reduction in symptoms and features of the disorder, right? And so that's very encouraging. You'll always have some little features of it if you have this disorder, but you can really mitigate a lot of it to where it be a lot more stable, a lot healthier, which is really encouraging. You just have to seek a lot of treatment, and that's okay, right? Vacillators obviously working through their childhoods and pursuing treatment as well. We see great results in your marriage. We're going to do marriage therapy as well as individual counseling to heal from your childhood hurts. So, all right, hopefully that answers your question and is helpful to you. If you have not done therapy, definitely go to intentionalcounseling.com. Either myself or a trained therapist will be happy to help you either virtually or in person. Right? If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. As always, subscribe. That helps us grow, which helps us help more people. And until next time, we appreciate you. Take care.